Got it. So it looks like we're live. Welcome to the last session on in South Asia and Pakistan. We're very excited to be hosting this from the Habib University. With us, we have an exciting panel of people. My name is Dr. Shama. I'm Associate Professor in Social Development and Policy. And we have Dr. Naqvi with us, who is sort of the all-over curator of this very interesting series. And we have two guests with us today who will be talking about the aspect of capitalism, racial capitalism. And so I'll and introduce Mishal Phan. So bear with me, please. Mishal, I'm just putting up your profile as we're going along. So just give me a second because I had it open a minute ago, but it will be here. So Mishal is a sociologist with a PhD in Chicago. Her work focuses on connections between labor governance in British South Asia and contemporary debates around the future of work, modern slavery, and global labor precarity. Her work has been published in Political Power and Social Theory and in Histories of Racial Capitalism, edited by Jenkins and Leroy, Columbia University Press, 2021. With us also is Farid Azfar. Farid Azfar is Associate Professor of History at Swarthmore College, and his work is on early modern European history. And he also is teaching and researches, particularly in the area of intersections of Atlantic history and the history of ideas and the history of sexuality and urban history. Past and future courses that he has led include London Beyond Control, the East India Company, the history of the body, and global in the early modern Europe survey. So the way we're going to sort of move forward in today is that we will ask each speaker to solicit questions after the start with Mishal. So Mishal, the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Dosa and Professor Naqvi, for this invitation. It's also a real honor to be back here. I was a visiting scholar at Habib University back in 2018 and benefited greatly from the sort of the institutional support that I received from scholars and professors there for my research while I was in Karachi. So it's kind of nice to be back 2 years later to sort of reflect on the findings that I was able to make over that time. And now that it's in sort of published form, hopefully I can give something back. So I just want to do a slight update about my title also. It's of no fault of the organizers, but as a sort of in one's post-PhD life, one does a lot of surfing between different institutions. So I'm in that strange interim period, having finished at the University of Austin at Texas last year, and I will be starting a position at the University of Hastings, University of California, Hastings Law School. So I'm just sort of in the interim right now. So I guess I just want to start by reflecting on the fact that I had asked for a different title to this panel. If you guys were tracking it, originally it was called Global Apartheid, which is a fantastic topic and a fantastic title. I asked for it to be changed to South Asia and the Global Color Line, because that would really enable me to focus on what I think about most in my work, which is really about the logic of labor extraction and capitalism, and sort of that sort of theoretical formulation helps us to bring these two together in a unique kind of way, and also allows me to talk about DuBois, who is a very influential scholar, not only in my work, but is kind of instigating a bit of a revolution in the discipline of sociology itself. So it's the sort of opportunity to reflect on that. I've really enjoyed the talks over the last few days, but I'm really struck, and I mean, I have to say I'm quite refreshed actually by the fact that there was very little talk about capitalism and the role that capitalism plays in the emergence of racial thinking in the modern world. So what I want to do in this talk is to share some of my reflections on what I think South Asia has to offer to urgent debates that we're having at the moment about capitalism and its history, or more specifically, racial capitalism and its history. So I'll start with DuBois' now famous formulation in his essay, The Dawn of Freedom, in which he said, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa and the islands of the sea. So DuBois was clear in his expansive body of work that he conceived of the color line as not just the division between Black and white, but a global racial ordering, with one of its primary features being, of course, the topic of our conference, white supremacy. In his formulation, European empire and capitalism were both inextricably tied together, creating a world that locked colonized peoples into subordinate positions, that enabled capitalists and colonizers to draw on their resources and, of course, their labor. In this sense, Black people in America and colonized races everywhere had a shared destiny to undo this global power structure. So DuBois is important for many reasons, but I want to highlight one of his biggest interventions, and that is to center the story of modernity not on the factory worker in Europe, but on the Atlantic slave trade and the racializations that emerged from this particularly violent episode of human history. So in this talk, I'm going to sort of try to reflect on that as a starting point. And I will actually not be talking about the chapter that some people might be familiar with in the histories of racial capitalism, but about another article that I wrote last year that was published last year in Political Power and Social Theory called Abolition as a Racial Project, which, sort of kind of answers these questions in a different kind of way, and sort of is the real, was really where I started with some of these explorations of what racialization means in the South Asian context. So Abolition as a Racial Project, which is the article, really tries to take on several fundamental questions that DuBois invokes. So the first question is, what did this global project of racializing categories look like in India? And where do our contemporary understandings of race, slavery, and Blackness in South Asia come from? And it's really the task is to unpack each of these categories and to think critically about them. And my intervention ends up being a little bit counterintuitive in certain ways. And I just want to anticipate the argument a little bit, and then I'll reiterate it later. So it became very clear to me that in South Asia, and perhaps in the colonial world in general, we have to flip the narrative. We need to focus attention away from the legacies of slavery and really more towards a focus on the forces on British abolition. British abolition itself was a central tool used to reorder the world for the purpose of global labor control. So, this in a way is sort of speaking back to DuBois by centering it in a sort of different kind of moment, but I would still argue that it still comes out of that same appreciation that racialization as a global process of modernity writ large began in the Atlantic world, and sort of had these different kind of contingent consequences in the rest of the world. So I will briefly sort of recount the main empirical pieces of the paper, and then reflect on the broader interventions of the paper on how to think about whiteness. I will not do a full presentation here. I don't have a slide, but I do have one graph that I will show. I've already made this joke, but I'll make it again. I'm a sociologist, so of course I do have to have a graph. Okay, so the piece that I want to talk about, Abolition as a Racial Project, really centers on two interconnected stories. First, how slavery as an institution became racialized over time to become associated overwhelmingly with Africanness, Blackness, and 𝐂𝐤𝐳, three terms that I will unpack. And second, and perhaps more importantly, how Indian slavery disappeared. So I start with a puzzle. In 1841, colonial reports estimate that there were over 8 million quote unquote slaves in British India. So we have this archival material, we have these vast reports in which the British are surveying all of the territories under their control, and they have extensive lists of different categories of slaves. And, there's been various estimates of them, but there were, some of the higher ones are that there were 8 million slaves. After 1843 is the year of Act 5, the Indian Slavery Act. It's the year when abolition officially comes to India. The East India Company says that from this day forward, we will no longer recognize the institution of slavery. So after 1843, we have almost no mention of slavery at all, except over time, the label of slavery increasingly concentrated on 𝐂𝐤𝐳 or Afro-Asians, or anyone who demonstrates African features. So this is a puzzle. How does this happen? And I think that this is something that a lot of historians, especially who focus on on Indian Ocean slavery, I think they've been very aware of this kind of dynamic. And there's other scholars like Johann Matthew, who's actually traced it really well and powerfully, on the Arabian Sea, and how this process sort of plays out in the ocean. But what I wanted to do was to first establish this empirically. Again, this is my sociological training. And to demonstrate that this sorting of categories was crucial to processes of global racial capitalism, in particular to establishing India as a site of free labor. So let me just dwell on this for a second. What does it mean to turn India into a site of free labor? And what were the stakes in this process? So first, I'll say that a really important part of doing this, or sort of discursively creating India as a land of free labor, was to not see slavery. To turn a blind eye from slavery was sort of the first step. And second, it was to construct Indian sociality in a way so as to render social hierarchy and relations benign rather than violent and subordinating. So these discursive moves made the movement of both capital to India as well as Indians to capitalists in the form of course, famous indentured servitude regimes, a legitimate exercise. So these ideological investments were not only there in order to avoid violating an anti-slavery regime. The abolitionists, increasingly had their eye on India and the kind of, they had a sort of globalizing vision of a world without slavery, and were perfectly capable of putting pressure on the colonial government. So, there's an argument to be made about that. But on the other hand, there was actually a very firmly held belief by agents of empire that the free market and free labor was the very epitome of progress. In fact, free labor was the more efficient alternative to unfree and slave labor. So there were very good reasons for not wanting slavery to exist in reality or in fiction. So in the paper, what I do is I make several claims that are really leveraging a very rich medieval historiography. Scholars much, wiser and greater that have been living in this for a while, Indrani Chatterjee, and, to sort of really make a couple of claims about the historical medieval period. The pre-modern period. One, that slavery as an institution was incredibly varied in the forms that it took. You can see this not only in the colonial reports, but you also see this when you understand, the historiography going back to the vernacular sources. Second, that slavery was ethnically diverse, if we want to use ethnicity as a stand-in for race here. And not only was it ethnically diverse, but the vast majority of slaves in India were Indian in the sense that they came from the region of the subcontinent and visually presented as Indian. And third, that exchanges between Africa and India stretch back many centuries and simply cannot be reducible to slavery alone. So how did we get here? So the main empirical piece of the paper is to examine a data set of instances drawn from the Bombay judicial and political proceedings to look at these encounters when agents basically intercepted men, women, and children suspected of being illicitly transported in and out of India. And really, we want to look at what made colonial agents see certain people as self-evidently slaves, while others were self-evidently not. So I thought by doing this, I really capture that magical change over time effect that allows us to see this racialization in motion. And for that reason, my cases start at 1843, which is the year of abolition, and go up to 1900. So I'm just going to share my slide here. Can everyone see it? Okay, great. So it's maybe a confusing slide, but let me just tell you what the main takeaways are. The main takeaways is that in the if you see the black squares, what you see is over time a growing preponderance of instances in which slavery cases always involved Africans or 𝐂𝐤𝐳 or 𝐻𝐵𝐺s. And may I say that the archive is very diverse in the kinds of spellings and terminology used to refer to 𝐂𝐤𝐳, 𝐻𝐵𝐺s, Africans, and many different spellings, which was in and of itself quite a challenge when I was doing my research. But the black squares basically represent any instance of that. And then what perhaps is even more interesting is that you can see that while there was Indian slavery, clearly institutions were seen as slavery involving Indians in 1840, over time, this category becomes fragmented. So you see that even where a transaction involves purchase and sale of people, that particular transaction is no longer legible as slavery. And then you have also women and children who are seen as trafficked, and they are actually stopped at borders, and there's a whole other gendered aspect to this. But they are not trafficked as slaves, they are trafficked, period. And this is actually a very important administrative point because the Indian Penal Code has a different section for being transported as slavery as it does for being abducted, kidnapped, or trafficked. So, so 2 points that over time, instances of slavery are almost overwhelmingly associated with Africans or 𝐂𝐤𝐳s, and that the category of that Indians are no longer legible as slavery, but as something else. Okay, so that's really the sort of two empirical findings of the paper. And I'll quote sort of the bottom line for me. As the law committed itself to turning a blind eye to Indian slavery, the institution seemed to all but vanish, disappearing in a puff of smoke. The tiny 𝐂𝐤𝐳 community, because it was a very small community in terms of the, we also have to debate whether or not we could call it the 𝐂𝐤𝐳 community a community as such, but in terms of how much of the population, they were a tiny portion of the population. So in a sense, the 𝐂𝐤𝐳 community was the residue left behind in this question of slavery. So the big arguments that come with this is to really center abolition and liberal ideologies as really a core place to start thinking about histories of unfreedom in South Asia. So, in my particular case, these were not violent processes of enslavement. These were benign processes of freeing slaves. So this really makes us think critically about categories of freedom. and asks us to sort of think about the legacies of these kind of liberal ideologies rather than just looking for the legacies of slavery. This also has something to say about the nation state and belonging, and it was interesting to hear this conversation happening over the last few days as well. So I argue that both erasure of Indian enslavement and the hypervisibility of 𝐂𝐤𝐳 as slaves have dangerous political and social consequences. And these legacies continue to shape the nation state and the social world. So the question is, what kind of historical inequalities within South Asia have been rendered invisible by these processes? And then the second question is, how has this restrained claims to belonging in the nation state for 𝐂𝐤𝐳 in South Asia? And then another thing is that this is kind of a rich encounter in which we can examine the emergence of 4 different racial categories. So obviously I've talked about Indian and an African, but I want to sort of reflect briefly on another 2 categories that are important for the task at hand here. And the third one is the Arab, the category of the Arab. So I talk about this a little bit in my paper, but I actually don't get into it as much as I would like to in the future. But you see in these encounters that the British are very quick to assume that Arabs are associated with a specific kind of illegality. So if an Arab is encountered, the assumption is always that the Arab as slave trader or the Arab as mercenary. So you kind of see the sort of racial trope of Arabness also becoming really salient in this particular moment. And then, of course, the 4th racial category is the category of whiteness. So, the colonial state power and white subjecthood was also being mutually constructed in the repetitive act of freeing slaves. Imperial agents accumulated moral capital by patrolling seas and borders and rescuing what they saw as the poor Africans who were in need of saving. The colonial state accumulated symbolic power by presenting itself as the noble Leviathan that needed to police sovereign borders in order to rescue people. So it was white people who knew what freedom was, and white Europeans that were capable of granting slaves passage across the threshold from freedom to slavery, from slavery to freedom through the symbolic act of liberation. So you see these 4 different categories really being solidified in this very powerful act of freeing a slave, which should be a mundane administrative process, but is of course imbued with all this significance in this particular emerging racial capitalist order. And then finally, what I want to say is that my intervention is really trying to focus on reconfigurations rather than simple exaggeration or grafting over pre-modern social hierarchies. So the 19th century was a powerful moment where, where I think we are seeing something new associations between different categories. And there's a big danger here of making this conflation. This is why I'm emphasizing this point so much. I want to say that there is something distinctive about the emergence of the association between slavery and Blackness that should absolutely not be confused for the South Asian association between dark skin and low status. At the same time, I want us to sort of think about how this makes us reflect critically on the category of whiteness. Might we also see whiteness as a specific historical formation that resonates with, but is ultimately distinct from the association that we are so familiar with between fairness or light skin with status? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that, if we see these different categories as really coming out of this particular period, then what is analytically distinct about the kind of South Asian iteration of this obsession with fair skin? And can we, maybe it's important to separate that from a lot of the studies that focus on white supremacy. So I'll just sort of end by gesturing a little bit to some of my other work. and kind of the broader implications here as well. So, you know, I argue in general that global abolition was the left hand of racial capitalism. And by that, I mean, the project of abolition was to eliminate a fixed notion of slavery in order to celebrate the triumph of the free wage labor relation. This legitimizes a whole range of incredibly coercive labor relations, from indenture, sharecropping, and coolie labor, by valorizing the fiction of consent and freedom. And what I also want to elaborate, and what this paper also elaborates on, is what I have called the sort of first layer of racial capitalism. And in my piece in racial and histories of racial capitalism, I really try to say that there are two processes at work here. One is this kind of global ordering of races, which is sort of focusing on the discursive production of difference from the viewpoint of, you know, imagine the capitalist sitting in London, you know, adjudicating between different categories of people and deciding who do we need to transport for my plantation that I'll be setting up, you know, in X corner of the empire. So there's this kind of global layer, right, of this emergence of these, maybe we could call them chunky categories of labor, of people. So, you know, obviously these were assaults on colonial subjects and their lived realities, but it was also for the more secular purpose of controlling labor. But what I also try to show in some of my other work is that capitalism actually expanded on many different fronts. And race actually only takes us so far to understand how it actually works on the ground in a place like South Asia or anywhere else, really. So we have the global scale, where biological notions of race were rampant and highly influential. But then, you know, you also have to think about, you know, what Cedric Robinson said was that the racial capitalist order also emerges from feudalism and from feudal social relations. And so to think about what makes feudal relations in South Asia tick, irrespective of, I mean, you know, maybe we have to go to that golden moment of the beginning of the colonial encounter to sort of understand those kinds of processes and what determined who was seen as landed in the first place and what determined, you know, where status emerged in that particular context. And race doesn't help us much. In fact, it confuses us. But what racial capitalism does as an analytic framework is to help us see how central processes such as the market, such as the law that sort of claim neutrality, essentially operate through difference, even if this difference is not something that we can call race. And Shabana Shankar's formulation the other day was very helpful when she, you know, really also sort of reiterated this idea that racialization is a process, and we focus on it as a process rather than as an endpoint. And this is where my work on Sindh was actually, you know, Sindh is considered a very marginal region in South Asian history, but to me, it actually helped me see things that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. So when you look at Sindh, I was looking at agrarian transformations in Sindh, you see that obviously the race is not a very viable social category, but neither is caste. Caste is also problematic in this context. So when I was doing work in Karachi many years ago now with Haris Ghazdar, he sort of talked about the kinship group as maybe an alternative social form that we might think about in the sort of particularly Pakistani context. But I want to argue that capitalism is actually very innovative in how it categorizes and dispossesses. And one of the key ways to maintain subordinated labor is to shift to new modalities of exploitation as soon as the threat and possibility of successful political mobilization of a particular category emerges. So race, caste, kinship, all of these are really just terms that we impose on a very complicated social reality that involves many different kinds of legacies, including slave legacies, perhaps, but not only. You know, so just to sort of think about these two layers of how racialization is and is not important if we want to understand the full picture. So I think I'll end there. My big question is really about whiteness and whether or not we might think about different forms of different formulations of social hierarchy in South Asia that look very much like whiteness, but aren't quite. So maybe a little bit provocative with, sort of engaging with the themes of the conference, but I really look forward to the conversation, and thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Mishal, for that really interesting talk. And I'm just going to, before we begin and open, I just wanted to check if there are any questions from people listening online. So we can just check if there are, if you can put the questions in the chat for Mishal. No. Okay, so I think actually, Mishal, the questions that you posed are super interesting, because starting from abolition is not usually which most people's starting point is when we talk about, I think, slavery and post-colonialism. So I think it's a really interesting entry point into the conversation. I guess for me, as more of a development practitioner who works in contemporary times, I find it quite fascinating that this notion, or the trope of freedom, like this language of freedom that is used, is so prevalent in today's discourse on development and this discourse on democracy that is used in Pakistan, in South Asia, as well as in the global north as well. And so I think it's really interesting to look at, the story and the language of freedom when it comes to labor, and how it's been institutionalized in different ways in current forms of democracy. And I was wondering if you'd like to speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, what my work is trying to, this is not just my work, a lot of people are trying to push the timeline back, right? So this emphasis on liberalism, on free market and privatization, etc., is actually a much older story. It's not a globalization story. It's actually embedded in the very sort of foundational structure of the colonial state and then the post-colonial state. So yeah, I think that reflecting on the fact that these are much older histories, and by that I mean older problems, helps us to sort of really grapple with the stakes of what is involved with this kind of discourse of freedom. Another of my interventions, or another thing that I think about a lot, is I think very critically about this whole modern slavery debate. And I think for somebody who does sort of look at development in the contemporary era, you're probably very aware of, the sort of the kind of the power relations that are involved in these modern slavery debates. And I think very critically about the act of the fact that we're rehearsing this in so many ways. So, bonded laborers, what do you do to fix bonded labor? You free them by sending them to slave camps, like that's sort of the model that a lot of development agencies are promoting in a place like Pakistan. And, we're reenacting the same kinds of fallacies. So I think that there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from this moment. It's interesting because this is a critique of my own sort of my own work. I really sort of start with the 19th century and then reflect on where we are today, right? So I really need to spend more time thinking about the sort of span of the 20th century, and to think about sort of what transpires in the middle and how we got where we are here today. But I do think that there's just a lot of resonance between these kinds of policies and what I'm seeing in the 19th century. So yeah, I think that's kind of my response.
Thanks. And I'm also like connecting it a lot to, the whole situation, cross-border migration, as well as refugee status, and how these stories of freedom sort of connect with that, but still embedded in the whole structure of capitalism. I mean, I was also really interested to see, you wrote this book chapter, I think, that also talked about whiteness, and this is where you talked about Sindh particularly.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw at some point you mentioned something about how, women, because of their gender, were sort of also like their level, or the ability for them to distract people, or their lower status, was sort of accepted because of their gender as well. But you didn't really go much more into detail into that conversation after that. And I sort of was left feeling like I'd like to have heard more about your thoughts of how gender and capitalism and sexuality sort of come together in this nexus of the conversation of labor and slavery. And so I was wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about that, or if you've advanced your thinking beyond that chapter in which you were talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I will say that, in another iteration of this paper that I was talking about today, Abolition as a Racial Project, the gender dimension is sort of crucial. So I talk about race, right? But what is really interesting is the fact that women and children are stopped at borders, right? So you have, but although not as slaves, which is what I'm interested in, but they still are stopped at borders. So you have this kind of gendered understanding of the ability to consent, right? So women are suspected of being trafficked and abducted and kidnapped because of the sort of core belief that there's something about an Indian woman's capacity to consent, right?
Or infantile.
Exactly.
Almost infantile, yeah.
Exactly. But that's not something that is attributed to men, right? But that gender division is crucial because you need men to pass freely through these borders in order to become, the indentured laborer or the wage laborer or what have you. So, it is kind of, it is striking how that gendered analysis and how these sort of capitalistic forms rely on these gender variations can be seen in this particular moment as well. So that is something that I'm thinking about more. I definitely do need to sort of incorporate that more in my thinking. I think this is one of the charges, I think, against the racial capitalism literature in general, that there's kind of two things that are missing, and one is gender and the other one is like colonialism, funnily enough. So that's kind of a blind spot on my part, and I need to do more thinking about it. So I appreciate that comment, but I tried to do a little bit of it in that piece, but one can always do more.
Yeah, sure. And it would be important to, I think, look at the intersectional element of it, right? When we're coming from the connection of also race from knowledge production, and also patriarchy and capitalism, and how these sort of formulate or feed off of each other in terms of the structures and systems. So I think it would definitely be an interesting piece. I'd be happy to read once you have something up on that. So I'd be excited about that. Nauman Sahib, do you have any questions for Mishal?
I do, but I'll wait until after Farid's thing,
okay,
and then we can address to both Mishal and Farid.
So Farid, I know you have a super interesting presentation. I got a glimpse, or of that really interesting image you put up. So excited to hear your presentation.
Let me see if I can find it again. I don't know when all of a sudden. Here it is. Okay.
Okay.
Can you all see it? I can now not see it. Can you see the screenshot, the slideshow?
Yes, but it's not on slideshow mode yet.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Now it is, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So the title, it was a great honor to speak here, and especially to speak after Mishal, whose work has inspired me a lot. And there's lots of things that I feel like I don't have to say because you've already said them. So the title of this talk refers to this image, which is a print, which occurs with no text in a publication called Graphic in 1888. This enigmatic print is actually a series of 4 panels in which turtle hunting or Apache Beach turtle hunt serves as a kind of satirical parable of colonial governance in the immediate wake of the Second Anglo-Afghan War. The first depicts DuBois unclothed and brown, starting early and going along the beach, while Smith, Brown, Crown, and company prepare to start later on. The second describes a scene in a camp in which the British allies the plan of campaign in which they dressed as a mock comes ashore right before. The scene continues with a tug of war between Turtle, Native, and Britain. Push Smith, get together Brown, say the characters, and the captions to a picture of 2 Englishmen who overturn each other in the process of turning the turtle. The element of danger so indispensably dear to English sportsmen, says a caption of the Englishman falling over. After an exciting but mistaken race, Brown nearly kills the decoy boy, says the panel below, next to an image of Brown nursing his foot. Revenge is sweet, says the panel in the middle, depicting the British feasting on turtles presided over by an obedient bearer. I want to start by suggesting that inasmuch as the Turtle Hunters was a parable of colonial governance, it was also one of colonial abjection, of whiteness in a state of fracturing. This was a story of a group of people possessed of a power produced for them by highly fortuitous historical conditions, and it reflects a subliminal consciousness of the fact that they were at once luckier and more incapable even than their own harder working colonial forebearers. So in Black Marxism, Cedric Robinson writes that the racialism or racial capitalism cannot be understood solely in terms of an obsession with property. The Black radical tradition was distinguished by its attention to the fact that something of a more profound nature than the obsession with property was askew in a civilization that could organize and celebrate on a scale beyond previous human experience the brutal degradations of life and most acute violations of human destiny. It seemed a certainty that the system of capitalism was part of it, but as well symptomatic of it. Drawing on Cedric Robinson, the French reunion scholar François Vergès has called for the concept of the racial Capitalocene, a historical period of climactic activity produced by the actions of racial capitalism, one that would help reveal that climate change was not about human hubris, but the result of the long history of colonialism and racial capitalism, and its Promethean thinking, the idea that man can invent a mechanical, technical solution to any problem. To develop a theory for a renewed history of the racial Capitalocene, Vergès says we have to study the matrix constructed by the army, science, engineers, business, state alliance. And that the point of constructing this history was not just to blame the West for everything, it was to retrace the role of human agency in constructing the problem so that the steps for reversing the problem could at least be imagined, if not effected. In a recent textbook called Colonialism as Global Perspective, Chris Manjapra has advanced this project by breaking down racial capitalism into 4 intersecting drivers: capitalist war, racializing rule, moral deception, and transformative resistance. The capitalist war, as Manjapra defines it, is fueled by principles of profit maximization, is a violent drive to subject peoples, including their lands, ways of life, and economic and cultural systems to the accumulationist urges of dominant groups. It arises from strategies to produce new value through destruction and to hide away and disregard the degree and damage caused by such destructive force. This kind of war pursues the ever deeper penetration of the mercantile principle into the realm of life. For Manjapra, it's key the determinants of this capitalist war are a complex mixture of opposing and combining forces, that it isn't just racializing rule and moral deception, but also transformative resistance that creates the conditions for what the battles are of the capitalist war, how it proceeds, why it proceeds. Going back to the turtle hunters, Robinson, Vergès, and Manjapra can help me make sense of them in many ways. Former, because it's clear that an obsession with property, that something much deeper and primal than an obsession with property is at work. You can't explain the event of the hunt, nor the parable that's depicted. And while the ever-growing alliance between engineers, multinationals, and scientists is not in fact described in the text, the casual details about native combatants waking up early to clear the battlefield, the jokes that equate them with turtles, are not just allusions to the Afghan war, but are also reflections of a global moment when the forces of imperial war are deployed and redeployed for a capitalist war that in turn creates the conditions in Karachi of a formative chapter, I argue, in the history of the racial Capitalocene. Capitalist war, racializing rule, moral deception, transformative resistance, all combine in the print. And in the rest of my talk, I will not talk about the print and turtles, but about an archive that I think about when trying to make sense of the transition that this text is trying to describe, or that this text represents. Specifically, what I'd like to discuss is a file from the Sindh archives, which describes a half-century of failed experiments in oyster fisheries, starting in the 1860s and continuing into the 1920s, at least until 1923, when the RAF airport was built on the site of one of the former oyster creeks in Karangi. My argument is not that these pearl fishery experiments are the source of whiteness, and nor that they're its most violent product, but they do reveal the racial logic of the geopolitical, biopolitical, and biospatial capitalist war that followed the conquest of Sindh. The shameful ironies of whiteness in Karachi, as embodied in the Turtle Hunters, are clarified by the Swiftian absurdity of a decade-spanning attempt at transporting oysters from Ceylon to India. What I want to discuss is how the focus shifts in the archive all of a sudden in 1874, when it was suddenly engulfed by the correspondence of a merchant whose name is alternately spelt as Sutumul, Rutumul, Nutumul, Rusumu, Nutumul, and Nursumul, who we know is a Bhatia merchant who plays a game of leveraging his capital worth and connections to the Persian Gulf Arab oyster industries to gain control over the colonial technologies of discipline. Months after receiving the contract by which he claims he'll recreate the Behrani pearl industry on the coast of Sindh, he writes to the collector demanding bills he would give to his peons in order to prevent the fishermen from picking up mother of pearl oysters. In case I give my own bills, he writes, the fishermen generally will not obey my peons. They will get frightened and will not be so bold as to commit any mischief. I want to suggest that here he's evoking a debt he believes he's owed for the wealth and capital that allow him to procure Arab pearl drivers, a debt the British will pay with their sovereignty. And the emotional force of this debt is exposed even further 3 years later when he's caught illegally fishing at 𝐂𝐤𝐤, which at this time was a princely state, thus getting in trouble with the Darbar, to whom he's turned in by his own servant, and then threatened with arrest by the British consul. He then writes, after all these letters come from the British consul in 𝐂𝐤𝐤 to Karachi, in a letter to the colonial authority in Karachi, he blames the arrest on his servant, who himself is jailed and beaten when he himself is released in security. The man Silu is a half-witted man, and you can form an idea of his intellect by having him brought before you. You can judge for yourself as to whether a man of my standing who pays government such a revenue and who incurs such heavy expenses in the prosecution of my trade would be likely to rob pearls the value of about 2 rupees, and what is more, actually go into 𝐂𝐤𝐤 territory and make a clean breast of what my trade was, that of a pearl contractor, at the same time showing the pearls I had with me. I trust explanations I have afforded will prove satisfactory and remove the injurious impressions the letter of the political agent in 𝐂𝐤𝐤 is calculated to cause. Somehow, in the course of a single sentence, he's gone from insulting his own servant to insulting the British agent in 𝐂𝐤𝐤. The idea that he is a pearl contractor, as opposed to a Bhatia merchant, is a legal cloak of whiteness that he believes is owed to him, as he insists on repeated occasions for reasons that relate to his ability to import Arab pearl divers from the Gulf. The intractable figure of Nursumul helps expose at least one aspect of the shameful secret that the turtle turning graphic hints at. This is a secret about the nature of governance in a frontier zone that is acquired under conditions of mutiny, whose agents are possessed of a force that they are unable to conceptualize. In 1892, the collector of Karachi constructs a history of the fishery from the archive. The point of the archive is to establish his own credit for the strict watch that the seacoast salt inspectors had created over the oyster fisheries to prevent them being disturbed by fishermen. He bragged about his orders resulting in the detection, arrest, prosecution, and conviction of fishermen, and went on to observe that from time to time, he had from 200 to 400 oysters collected and opened to see what seed obtainable from them was like, but never found pearls any value. Like the man who cuts into the goose that lays the golden egg, he finds no pearls. And he realizes that these pearls only are profitable when mixed with Bahraini pearls. And he says at the end, "This year, I thought the sale of the rate of farming might be tried again, as I had an application from Nursi Mall for a lease of 3 years at 500 rupees, 100 a year. By advertising it as possible, a higher offers will be recovered." The vigorous sense of immunity displayed in this turtle hunting print, which appeared just 4 years before this letter, animates these casual reflections whose long-term effects are marked in several contracts that are signed with oyster contractors, from which in turn spawn multiple regimes of governance, discipline, and exclusion. The biopolitical pretext of oyster scarcity and oyster security become the pretext for this elaborate labor regime in which oysters are opened only in the presence of the contractor's clerk, overseer, and peon, who in turn is tasked to see that all the immature oysters are returned. The oyster proceeds are used to pay the land revenue, as a result of which new sites of oyster experiments are continually formed and new regions of extraction identified. It's stipulated through a series of archival markings that the oyster contract will not necessarily go to the highest bidder, that they need to have someone who's respectable. The ghosts of Nursi Mall haunt the archive this way. The second quote below is from 1904, when collector 𝐒𝐤𝐻 concludes, upon reading the correspondence dating back to 1895, that the exhaustion of the once renowned oyster beds of Karachi has been due mainly to their being destroyed faster than they could recover, especially since the practice of packing them in ice has made it possible to send them to upcountry markets. His response was to propose a system of closed seasons, private licenses, and oyster-specific leisure regimes. No attempt is made to conceive or account for the effect of new foreign demands produced not only by the train lines, but also by the nameless force that was sending both oysters and famine-struck refugees from Kutch to Karachi. But the volatility of the larger context does seem to inform his proposal that the oyster beds in Moripur be kept as a preserve for experiment. His predecessor Judd's experiment had failed because the broken tiles were too easily disturbed. I have been making inquiries whether blocks of stone or concrete or too heavy for man to move could be obtained from demolished buildings in Manora or Kemari without cost. If some boatloads of these were laid down and strictly guarded, good results might be expected. I think this minor detail illustrates how the colonial state continually seizes upon the waste and destruction of capitalist war to recolonize Karachi's economy. It serves as a sign as well of what Charles Mills has described as the epistemology of ignorance that animates white supremacy, as a result of which whites are not able to understand, in one of his very colorful phrases, the world that they have been able to make. Key to Mills's epistemology is a constant slip between what he says are de jure and de facto contracts. Hence, a system created under de jure regimes of white supremacy would perpetuate the problem through de facto regimes like property that perpetuate the racial division while avoiding its origins in race. And it's critical to Mills that the ignorance itself doesn't spring from the soul of whiteness, that it results in part from the structure of the archive. But the case of Atkin, I think, helps suggest how this epistemology of ignorance also helps create the conditions for what Regis calls the racial Caplacene. This is an ignorance that's based on a kind of narcissism that emerges on the one hand from the heightened sense of racial power that is pictured in the turtle hunters and buttressed by the radical immunity from consequences that all these figures display, but ultimately also suggested by their inability to understand the force that is represented by their own very orders. It's not an ignorance that's about secrets that are hidden away in some faraway archive. It's about the absence of conceptual framework to understand who they are and what they're doing. I want to conclude with the case of James Hornell, who is a marine biologist who turns to the oyster reefs of Karachi from the point of view of a colonial conchologist. He writes a series of letters from Ceylon and Baroda. And in these letters, we see how a fundamental inability to understand how cause and effect work in a colonial capitalist economy creates the incapacity, the intellectual incapacity that perpetuates the racial Capitalocene and creates the social and physical structure of Karachi. So in 1906, he writes a letter in which he asks for information about pre-colonial oyster fisheries in the vicinity of Karachi. And there's much to be said about the dates in this letter, but they clearly suggest that oyster fisheries and oyster fishing had been an industry for a very long period of time in the region that becomes Karachi. But the purpose of this text is to prospect Karachi for future sites of oyster production and also to use the experiment of Karachi to devise oyster fisheries in other parts of India. And this is a process that involves distinguishing the deltaic channels of the Indus from the Karachi backwater, in which, as he observes, a collusion of winds, currents, and river flows had produced multiple sites of oyster production. Oysters being animals that thrive in places which are occasionally inundated and yet removed from the currents of the river. So these texts are not from Hornell, these are from the Karachi, from the Sindh archives, but just help remind us that our city was an archipelago. It was an archipelagic formation. In all these letters, they cannot go from one part to the next without getting on a ship. There's a lot to be said about that. But I want to suggest that part of what he creates through this text is a secret oyster map of Karachi, which is designed to shift the paradigm away from the regime of closed seasons. That part of around this map, which I'll go back to some of these texts, is a regime of is this idea that he articulates repeatedly that 2 years of closure would be nullified by 2 days fishing, that the problem is not even theft, that the problem is that an oyster reef is decimated after 2 days because of the intensity in which the reaping occurs. But he calls for a control that could be effected through a combination of military, fiscal, and disciplinary technologies that would allow the colonial authorities to create and capitalize on oyster scarcity in the name of oyster security. He called for an annual fee to be exacted from each licensed oyster collector, the supervision of oystermen, and then he says that the oystermen would be the primary beneficiaries, and the consumer who obtained the valuable luxury he desired would rightfully have to pay a contribution towards the expenditure. For the privilege of collecting oysters in the creeks, a fee of 1 anna a dozen would certainly not be too great in a time of oyster scarcity, such as present. The class who consume oysters would, I'm sure, be very willing to pay this extra in order to obtain the requirements. But in order for this regime to function, the whole of the actual verse of surveillance and experiment would have to be entrusted to the officers of the sea customs, partly since the supervision and inspection of the creek oyster beds dovetailed very largely with the ordinary duties of the customs, which were already in control of the pearl fishery. Now, this structure doesn't necessarily fully, that in his description and his final proposal does not fully display what one of the fears, one of the images that's motivating it, which we see in these quotes, in which repeatedly he blames the decimation of oysters on the behavior, on the actual practices of the oyster fishermen. The text is filled with images of this man going to some part of Karachi and seeing so many oysters that they were like a pavement and you couldn't even walk because there were so many oysters. And then these admonitions of how these men made to stand in these incredibly painful positions are taking off entire clumps. And he says, it was an unrehearsed and enlightening demonstration of the reckless methods of spoliation whereby these creek beds have been brought to a state of utter ruin. The serious abuses of the oystermen were, as he insists throughout the text, the true reason for overfishing, which was far more important than subterranean volcanic explosions, cyclones, and rivulets, and the destruction of the oyster reef. His lesson that he derives from the revival of a creek that had been closed for 2 years was a valuable object lesson, as it enabled me to learn precisely the extent of nature's power in restoring the prosperity of a bed when given the time and opportunity to do so. The operations of the oystermen, whom I saw engaged in collecting oysters, afforded me the requisite information on the converse proposition of how quickly unrestricted fishing may exhaust the improvement made during the period of closure. Perhaps it would be an exaggeration to say that the oystermen are a racial category, but certainly the way that Hornell blames the destruction of the oyster reef on the fishing practice of the oystermen is racializing in multiple ways. Not only does it result in a proposal to unleash the military colonial machine on the oyster reef, his racializing epistemology of ignorance is also a source, clue as to the formation of the racial Caplacene. Because it's not that Hornell was unaware of the actual force that was causing the destruction of the oyster reefs. The oyster collectors, Omar Safour and Sumar Ibrahim, had told him about how the construction of railways and the increase in demand from the northwest of India resulted in a period of ruthless exploitation, which led to the exhaustion of oyster reefs in Navanar and Moripur, thus propelling the colonial state to invade more and more reefs. But closing the industry was not an option for him, because the collector feared that the closure of all the creeks would cause inconvenience and result in the market being closed, a fear that makes more sense when we look at the archives that are referring to the land revenue being paid by the oyster revenue. But perhaps these archives also clarify the brevity of Hornell's suggestion buried away in a paragraph of his 22-page text, that the source of the problem lay in the destruction of the mangroves. Today, there are naked mudflats readily eroded along the margin now that the protective silk-arresting mangrove grub is destroyed. As a land reclaiming agency, as a source of firewood, and as a grazing for camels, the replanting of these mudflats appears to me extremely desirable. This, however, is buried inside. It's not his final recommendation. Science could not stop the death of mangroves, but science could map out new oyster beds. And the secret oyster maps of Karachi, much like his final recommendation, were part of a debt that he pays back to the colonial officials of Karachi, not only for their hospitality, but also for the information that the case of Karachi provides him, an oysterman whose main agenda are oysters and propagation of oysters all over India and the British Empire, not just Karachi. But I want to highlight here is that the ability of colonial science to cause destruction was directly proportional to epistemic incapacities that were products of the racialized biopolitics that's displayed in a range of strategies, from incentives to compulsions that prevent the fishermen from eating oysters, block off the oyster territories, and close the commons, fence them off. It is manifested as well in the absence of archival records that study the effects of the policy. Archive is not designed to study the force that connects the developments in the oyster archives to the archives which describe the effects of famines, plagues, telegraphs, lascars, harbors, and the First World War and the construction of Karachi. It's not designed to study itself. As Vergès writes of the racial Caplacene, the politics of the possible also rests on imagination, on the freedom to dream other paths and imagine other futures than those suggested by the racial Caplacene. The prowling pirates up and down due pace, may Lord my modest craft protect when proud vessels have been cruelly wrecked, writes Shah Abdul Latif in Sursari Rag, a verse that one scholar has suggested was a clarion call against Western colonialism more than 2 centuries before Hornell's visit. It seems that the target of Risalo is a world where freedom and oppression move to the rhythms not only of empire, but also capitalism, patriarchalism, orthodoxy, enslavement. In Song of the Shark, he writes of a great fish that has come, that is acting upon the fishermen, that is that is keeping them under states of indebtedness. The lake has dried up and the tax collectors have left. I've had to borrow fish. God, bring back the fishermen. Almighty Lord, do not let me be ashamed before the traders. My final suggestion is that the predatorial debt abstractors that are pictured as descending on the fishing village of Karachi are premonitions not just of the turtle hunters or James Hornell, but also of the Bhatia merchant. That the hospitality that of the legendary hospitality of Karachi merchants was a theme that pervades many texts that are written in the 18th century, not just the 19th century. But also that, as seen from the point of view of Shah Abdul Latif, the Bhatia merchant and the English geologists are part of the same problem. They're part of the same imbalance in the stratosphere that creates the racial Capitalist. But I don't think the ultimate lesson has to be one of pure despondency, because the capitalist war that is staged on and waged upon the archipelagic, shape-shifting, politically recalcitrant trading zone that was Karachi depends, as the Bhatia merchant reminds us, on pre-existing energies of a city that has long combined the elements of the smuggling den and a pirate's nest. The Opium Wars, the Indian Mutiny, the American Civil War, the Afghan War had all occurred before they tried to turn it into a battlefield in the capitalist war in nature. And that even today, beset as it is by crisis, the utterly exceptional place that kind of springs from the world of Latif Salo can also be a battleground for reimagining the future of the racial capitalist scene. Just gonna end that talk.
Thank you, Farid. I mean, one can go into all sorts of interesting directions with this narrative, and I want to just start by appreciating, you know, the storytelling element that you brought to the presentation today. I really, really enjoyed that, and I think, you know, bringing in the different themes of the sea and how Karachi is sort of centered in it, but also the history of capitalism that is sort of connected to the city in itself is fascinating to hear. So I don't think many people who are listening to you speak actually knew about the oyster industry in Pakistan or how it actually existed in the time before. You know, so I think it would be really interesting just for people to learn a little bit about the history of the city that they live in, but also to frame, you know, the broader sort of conversations that you're sort of putting together in connecting it to ecological exploitation and capitalism, and how these themes are sort of not something that are sort of a conversation that are happening now, but they have been happening historically. It's just that we haven't really seen these archives in the way that you've sort of presented them, where you can actually pick out these themes coming through. So Nauman, I'm going to hand over to you a little bit to maybe begin some of the questions, but I also want to check again if there are questions from anybody who's listening in on the feed, the live feed. So we just wanted to double check so we don't want to miss any questions there.
They're checking. There aren't any questions.
Okay,
right?
that's perfectly fine. I think that we have a lot of material to ask between the two speakers we have here today. So Nauman, would you like to go ahead? Because I already asked two questions from Mishal before, so yeah.
First of all, thank you, Mishal and Farid, for those excellent presentations. So much material to think through. My head is literally spinning from all of these stories and analyses, and challenging theoretical frameworks, challenging theoretical questions. So if I may take up a suggestion, if I'm reading correctly, from Mishal, you know, the reference to Frederick Robinson on the theme of racial capitalism and his location of the origins of racial capitalism in the Middle Ages, that is in the pre-modern period. obviously, Frederick Robinson is like, 10,000 times a greater scholar than I'll ever be. With that humility, I'd nevertheless like to question this idea. I mean, there are obviously always continuities and discontinuities in history. Yeah, so I take it that, I mean, both of you are historians. I'm not properly a historian, but correct me if I'm wrong. The part of the task of the historian is to measure the relative measure of continuity and discontinuity in whatever particular historical, whatever particular historical moment we're talking about. Yeah, that's part of what is involved in historicization, is the relative measure of continuity and discontinuity. Now, I take it also to be the case that the modern period, is characterized by unprecedented transformation, in all spheres of life. Really, I mean, the revolution, ongoing revolution. And I don't mean that obviously necessarily in a positive sense at all. Very, very dramatic transformations, ruptures. So the element of discontinuity and the reframing. I mean, obviously nothing, just as, and so this is a bit of Derrida in here. No repetition without difference. But also no difference without repetition. But here, the difference, the reorganization of these concepts. So there might have been, for instance, skin pigmentation. The phenotypical aspect of race. There might have been, in different locations, different phenotypical preferences. I don't think it was uniform across the world or across different regions. So I take it that that's one of the major transformations that happened, is there's this crystallization of this idea of whiteness and light skin, that happens in the modern period, and really over the course of the 19th century. I don't think even in the 18th century, and probably like you guys are locating it in the latter half of the 19th century, is when there is really this crystallization in our region of this ideology, and it's an ongoing process. So for me, but that's not the only aspect I take it. I mean, I've said earlier in the course of this conference as well, that what for me distinguishes this modern racial ideology, is precisely once a white supremacism, which is anatomically based. So the scientific racism that everybody talks about, the emergence of scientific racism, really from the late 18th century through the 19th century, and it crystallizes in the latter half of the 19th century. But also the idea of historical supremacy. So race and history are closely intertwined in the modern period. And that and the civilizing mission is obviously closely tied in with that. And the kind of racial hierarchy that Farid was also talking about, is also simultaneously a historical supremacy that we're talking about. So that aspect, I don't think you would see in the past, that people would think, because the idea of progress didn't exist. The idea of, these stages of civilization, which are racially colored periods of history. Africa or Africans represent the origins of humanity, the most primitive, etc. And then, as civilization proceeds, you eventually end up with the supremacy of the white races, which is simultaneously supposed to be their natural legacy, natural inheritance. So racial ideology is obviously also contradictory in all kinds of ways, because it's nonsense. Ultimately, it is nonsense. So I don't know what you think of that, but that's how I partly think of the problem. So to my mind, that's what's unique in this new situation that we are in today. So what do you think of that, anyway? So sorry, if I may add to that. Yeah. So obviously this idea of, there's a bit of a tension between a more Marxist analysis, but also, I'm more influenced personally by Foucault and the biopolitics, yeah, which is a new and independent variable. Yeah. So these arts of government, colonial governmentality, or biopolitics, yeah, these are strategies of government, which of course, might resonate with capitalism, but are not reducible, yeah, to capitalist logics. Yeah, they have their own independent logic. Yeah.
No, thank you for the comments and the observations. I think you're touching on a contradiction in the way that I see these things operating, but a contradiction that I do try to explain, or maybe try to explain how I think about it working. So, I started the presentation off by saying you start with racialization of Atlantic slavery. And then I said, well, then I'm going to move to Cedric Robinson and I'm going to start it with feudalism. So those are actually two different starting points, and one can see how they're contradictory in a certain kind of way. But I take your point that that the modern world is, characterized by an entirely new set of social structures. And the big message of the paper was recalibration, not exaggeration, right? Which is exactly what you're saying. There's something new, there's novelty here. And I think that is absolutely true. And that is why I guess I fall back on this concept of layers, So in one sense, you do have this wholly new world that's being created. But in another sense, an observation that I can't remember who it was. I think it was the first talk. They said, most of South Asia went through the colonial period without actually seeing a white person. So the idea that the sort of underlying logics of how something like neutral instruments of capitalism, right? Debt, land transfers, these mundane administrative processes that involve things like who gets to keep land, who doesn't get to keep land, how are contracts enforced, things like that. These happen on a level which are not, which are in the sort of framework of what is happening to India in general, but are actually very discrete processes. So that's why I'm saying you have to understand feudalism as the sort of starting point for seeing how these things unfold, in these dusty corners of empire. So you have your revolutions, you have your plantations, and you have these things where you can see these global historical forces really clashing in a very pronounced way. History is being made on these sites. But what I am curious, what I'm interested in, this is what 𝐶IND really, is, I really lean into 𝐶IND's marginality in this sense, because it allows you to see how outside of all these dramas, there is actually these sort of older structures of feudalism are very much intact. So it is in some ways the old world, but capitalism is progressing, right? Like these neutral instruments, these bureaucracy, these administrative instruments, they are progressing, even if the social structure itself is not being, sort of still retains a lot of these characteristics. So I think that is what my response is. I think that, and I think that some of this is not, that's why I guess I go back to the layers, because it's not possible without this broader layer, right? So the idea of Indian labor as free, the idea that we need to, that sort of internal forms of resistance and internal challenges to hierarchy are sort of muted and, kind of do not gain the kind of political traction that maybe they would have had there been a different conception of Indian sociality. That has everything to do with reinforcing these feudal structures, right? So it's not that there's still a sort of a dialectical relationship, but I think that you really have to start there. So I guess that's my answer. It's a complicated answer. I'm still thinking about it, I think. But there's this real tension between old and new, and I guess my very cop-out answer is, well, it's both. But I think I would like to insist on that. But maybe I have to think more about exactly how that relationship plays out analytically and how to sort of conceptualize that. But I think everything you're saying it strikes true to me.
Yeah, that was Chandra. I think it was Chandra Malampalli.
Yes, exactly.
Who mentioned that.
Yes.
But the reason for that was, as several people have argued, historians, that they created this unique kind of spatial structure. I mean, they all lived in cantonment areas. I mean, it's amazing. You see all these, films from the colonial period, and you never see a white person. You never see how little represented, white people are in our cinema. And actually, those who do appear are Anglo-Indians who were not really considered part of white society. In fact, they would not be allowed in the cantonment areas. They might be allowed a visit. Yeah, they would not be allowed because, of course, they were miscegenated. Yeah. As far as the feudal question is concerned, so, starting with the rule of property for Bengal, from what I understand, is that what we today call feudalism in South Asia resembles, this is what's remarkable about colonialism. Is about modern apartheid colonialism. That's that's what I like to be expressed. Modern apartheid capitalist colonialism. Yeah, because that was what was unique, right? About the modern colonial state is it was both capitalist and apartheid. Yeah, so the purpose of a feudal lord or the purpose of the king, etc., was not accumulation, unlike the East India Company. The purpose was to rule. There was extraction, obviously, yeah, but the ultimate purpose of the state would have been to rule rather than to accumulate wealth. So in that sense, and then so there were the feudal lords became modern capitalist lords, right? Now, I'm thinking, obviously, I don't know. Unfortunately, I really don't know, as I'll be honest here, I don't know as much about Sindh as I do about other parts of the subcontinent. But that's my general sense, is that that's how it works out, yeah, is this transformation. So, mentioning feudalism then is disorienting, I would say. Yeah, is disorienting in this regard. I mean, the purpose, and as far, the other question, the other thing that occurred to me, Farid mentioned, I want to get to more positive parts of your presentations. Yeah, this is not exactly the conversation that I wanted to be having, right? But because you made such excellent contributions, which require much reflection on our part. But I've lost my train of thought all of a sudden.
That's okay. We can let Farid respond. Yeah, go ahead with Farid.
No, yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in all of this, but so Cedric Robinson, I realized I've come to the conclusion that, like, it's a fact that there's many things about Black Marxism that I love, but they're not necessarily consistent with each other or even part of the same theory. But one of the ideas, I just published something in which from my first project, in which I use his discussion of the medieval period in which he talks about feudalism. And it's one of his points, one of the ways I explain it to students is that he's like, guys, it's not a coincidence that the people who did like a whole millennium of crusades would then become, you know, the pros at slave trading, like that these two things are actually related to each other. And specifically, he talks about how there's, you know, how in the European medieval context, there's an alignment between the kind of labor someone performs and their, you know, ethnic religious status. So like Slavs, Jews, all the other characters are placed into particular labor categories. But also there's a kinetic dimension to what he's saying, in which he's like, these people have been fighting with each other for a million years. They've developed state systems and infrastructures that are historically unlike any other civilization. And he specifically concentrates on Africa, and then makes the point, which when he's making it is very counterintuitive, that Africans were not actually fighting in the ways that the Europeans were fighting. Of course, they were fighting and enslaving each other, but they did not have a centralized state system that was involved in this consistent, you know, process. But I think that it's important in the same way as in a way what Mishal, your work is important also in helping us look at how the process of racialization doesn't always declare itself as such, that it's partly about institutions and technologies that get transferred from one place to the other. And in that sense, I think it's very similar to Foucault in that the central point of Foucault, one way to be racist without saying that you're racist is to like have policies where some people get to live and other people get to die. That biopower, that the hierarchies that allow some people to live and other people to die produce racializing circumstances. So going back to the oysters, I mean, I did not talk about the multiple cases of the petitions of the fishermen are presenting, asking to farm the oysters and eat the oysters, and then these debates that are happening over whether the edible oysters can be eaten or not. But that's all biopower, and it's all connected to, I'm with you, Mishal, that like, I don't think race is exactly the name to call this, but I'm not sure what to call a system that's preventing some people from living and other people from dying, that's like destroying with this spectacular waste a kind of a region that's produced life for millennia. Like that's kind of the point that I'm trying to communicate in some of the earlier stuff. So I see Foucault is useful for that. And coming back to your point about history, I mean, DuBois, the piece that really, you know, I mean, everyone read DuBois before I did, so I'm not claiming to be a DuBois specialist, but in 2020, I was reading Souls of White Folk, and I was like, I don't know if any of you have read it, not Souls of Black Folk. Souls of White Folk is this essay that he writes in Darkwater, in which he talks about World War I, and in which he's like, it's not a coincidence that you all just destroyed each other. It's related to the fact that you developed all these technologies in which you destroyed the rest of us for all the centuries before. But his point is also not just about death and about war and race, but it's that the difference, I mean, that he keeps saying is like, he's like, well, it's not that like we're better as Black people or yellow people or brown people, but we don't think so highly of ourselves. We have not created these narratives where we are convinced that anything good that happens to us is a product of us being racially better. And by the way, if you don't stop this, you're going to have another genocide, he says, right? So he's, you know, I see him as saying that racism has a historical epistemology that is based on a particular conception of debt, of who owes what to whom. And that's why I think this point you're making about slavery and the law, it's so brilliant. Like the idea of the abolition of the legal category actually perpetuating the institution, and especially if you have evidence of people being sold, I mean, I think that's huge, and it's so important, because I think I'm with you in that I see a lot of forcing that's happening. Like, we had this too, either we were racist ourselves or they were racist to us. But it's like, I do think that all these ideas, when I was reading DuBois, he reminded me of my nana. Like, he sounds like him, not in his politics, but in the way he talks about white people as being, he's like, who are these people? Who do they think they are? Like, I was there when we're just nothing. It's a very different kind of sentiment. And then, you know, Robinson says at many points, he's like, I'm talking about the Black radical tradition, but let me tell you, people all over the world have been like, there's something really strange and bizarre about this behavior. Even interests in economics do not explain the behavior of the whites. So like I see, it's not that I don't see the resonance, but at the same time, it's not, it is, you know, after the American Civil War, it is the same apparatus. It is you know, contracts and systems that form in New Orleans are flooding the archives in Karachi. But I don't know if we can call it white supremacy, but I also I don't think it's just class or any of the other terms, certainly not just caste. I totally agree with you there. I totally agree with the idea that caste is somehow the approximation for race, or even that casteism is the only thing that needs to be discussed more. Not that it doesn't need to be discussed more, but I think that there's a caste determinism that's now taking over what used to be class determinism and then became, so anyway, that's all.
So I'm just wary of time because it is almost 10:30 in Karachi and we're supposed to end here. So as a concluding question, I guess I would ask, because there are a lot of students who are really interested in the conversations we've been having today, is if you were to be teaching a class for students here in Karachi, how do you think it would be useful for them to look or to understand the analytical categories that you presented to look at modern day Karachi? What would be the value, or how would you present it to them in a way that would help them to understand and make sense? So this is something just as a thought for you as we conclude. So any reflections on this?
Well, I would say as a sort of practical point, spend as much time you can in the Sindh archives, because history is really important. And I have to say that I had a lot of trouble getting access to the Sindh archives. So, you know, the more available we make that material, the richer we're going to be for it. You know, analytics. So, and just to sort of respond quickly as by way of sort of a response also to your question, but also Dr. Naqvi's question, feudalism too is a bad category, right? And I fully accept that. And I really take that point about this sort of, you know, the idea of Indian feudalism comes right out of, you know, the English, you know, property systems, which is completely true. It's very hard because you have to be constructivist and then you have to deconstruct and then deconstruct. So I'm saying it's not, we don't look at slavery as slavery, we look at feudalism, but feudalism in and of itself is its own problem. So then let's be more precise and say, you know, the specific historical structures that, and it depends on your question, right? I think that's the other thing. You have to be specific about your question. Like everything is capitalism in one sense, but then no, if you're looking at the history of who had the right to, you know, the yields of the land in a particular historical moment, then you sort of have to ask a very specific question. There are more specific actors that come out of that. And I don't know if we call that feudalism, right? But you'd call that something which is structured in a way where zat, caste, kinship, you know, sort of constructed notions of who is better than who are incredibly important. So, you know, we use these words, these analytical categories, because we have to, but I think history helps us see, you know, helps us take that step back, you know, and say, these are the problems with them, and that we have to be very specific in what exactly we're asking, you know. I don't know if that's a good answer, but I sort of wanted to accept the point and also to say, go to the archives if you can.
Farid, do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, so I chose these in particular because of all the stories about what's happening right now with all the different regimes of dispossession. I think that, I mean, some people are more likely to want to hear it than others. That's the most advice I can give, is that, like, I strongly believe that whatever is happening in the early 19th century profoundly shapes not just the structure of the city, but the structure of how we think about its possibilities. But to me, what's most interesting is, well, they provide a vision of what we could have been and what we might be, but also they reveal how the problems that we're facing were products of actual choices that actual people made. And they weren't just this like inevitable succession of crises that we're trained to think we represent. And then also, I mean, as I talked, Habib 2 months ago, I talked about the fishing village myth and how this idea that we're a fishing village is also a way of giving, you know, of indebting ourselves to our colonizers because they brought us into modernity. And that, you know, that's, I mean, there's like from the moment the archive starts, which is around the 1840s and the 1850s, it's like, I find it just like, imaginatively speaking, just so thrilling and disorienting, and you know, because it's like, what, they were runaway slaves from Muscat in Karachi like before annexation? What was going on there? And then it all starts to kind of make sense. So I just think that, I mean, on an emotional level, it's useful, but also I think that as an explanation, there's not the part of me that's an academic that turns to these colonial documents and understanding the climate crisis. It's part of me that's just trying to understand it at the most, you know, basic level. Like, what is happening? How can it be stopped? There's some, you know, that there's some kind of assumption we give that the two alternatives we live in are between military theocracy and, you know, colonial utopia, and that I think that, or, you know, colonial nostalgia, and that there's, you know, in which secularism and communism and, you know, all of our cafes and hotels, and that there's, you know, not only is it limited, it's limited even in how it helps us understand who we are and where we are and where the kind of in the larger map of the future. And that's my final thing to say to students is like, you know, the world will tell you repeatedly that we're irrelevant, will suggest that we beat the ocean and no one will care. None of that has to be because we make voices, because that's one inspiration I get from the Black radical tradition is like, you know, these people had every reason to believe that anything they wrote or said would have no effect. Not suggesting that we're equivalent to them, but that there's a lot that we can do in how we change the imagination. And a lot of that has to do with being on the front lines of what's called the racial capital scene. It's true that most of the climate crisis is coming to Karachi before it's coming anywhere else. And I think that our own, you know, ways of making connections between the global, the imperial, the racial are as important as inspiring ourselves from traditions of other oppressed people around the world. So draw upon our traditions, contest your elders, don't get gaslighted or mansplained your uncles. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I almost feel like it's enough, material for a Amitabh Ghosh trilogy, you know, for the Indian Ocean. I mean, in a way, I mean, it is fascinating to hear like all the material that you can access through the archives, and so
it's amazing, and it's so
session,
important that it's protected. Yeah. I'm so nervous that some ministry will come. It's just incredible. The material is incredible. I've been trying to start to work on getting someone to get a digitization grant, because there's no way that, I mean, I can, like, even with the materials from like 6 different binders, you could write a whole book. There's just so much in there. And Karachi is so central to so many histories, and it's so marginalized, even though historically speaking, we were. I mean, you go to Muscat and the first bank that you see, I mean, we just don't know our connections. And the archive, you do not have to look far in it, as Mishal, you must know also, to see, just have things explode out at you.
I mean, I will say, I mean, I would love to hear more about the digitization, but I don't know if you know this, but in the attic of the Sindh archive, they have Karachi District Court records going from 1873 or till, you know, I think probably till 1900 in English and in Sindh, and they have the Shikarpur District Court records. That is gold, like it's absolute gold. And, you know, you got to fight to get access to it. But once you do,
that's incredible, yeah.
Digitizing those, like, it would be a complete game changer, to think about.
Yeah, they also have the police archives from, which are, I mean, I mentioned briefly 1857, but it had not occurred to me how much, it's the only major city that they conquer. Or, they've conquered it before 1857, but that they settle and colonize using all the mutiny laws. And so you see all of the police, all of the police technologies from all India are coming to Karachi. They're able to pick and choose in ways they cannot help anywhere else. So again, another way in which the past and the present live together. All of the petitions about merchants saying that they'll only care about us if we make ourselves an urgent military requirement. It's very haunting, but it's also, I don't know, I find it inexplicably inspiring and really weirdly hopeful.
Thank you, both of you. It's been a really inspiring evening for us. So I hand over to Nauman sir. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to also make a couple of remarks since this is the final panel. First of all, of course, I want to thank everyone. Well, why don't I say that afterward? Because I want to say something about this ratio. Why, people will want to, people often wonder why is it that, we keep talking about race here at Habib University, because it's so unusual in South Asia. Yeah, it's a part of our curriculum, also part of the course that all of our students take, what is modernity, etc. So for me, there are multiple investments in this question. First of all, it was obviously very, very important to the entire modern period. Just as true over here. In fact, people don't, the way South Asians have repressed the whole racial aspect, is simultaneously informs, of course, as Mishal is also, I think, gesturing towards that, is the terrible attitude towards Africans that exists amongst us, has to do with our own repression of our own, racial oppression. But the other aspect of race, which I find, disastrous, is the fact that, this is what biopolitics does, is reduce human beings, and which is what capitalism also does, is to reduce human beings to biological life. Yeah. So one of the things that philosophical revolution that happened in the modern period. So there's this book by David Wooten. This is just one example. There are other books like this called Power, Pleasure, and Profit. Yeah. Insatiable appetites from Machiavelli to Marx. Yeah. So during this time also, the idea is developing that human nature is about the pursuit of power, pleasure, and profit. Yeah, which of course reduces, in this completely hedonic understanding of human beings, reduces human beings to their whatever. I mean, it's an abstraction, in fact, because not even animals are like this. Yeah, it's a complete abstraction and a senseless idea about what existence, not just human existence, but even animal existence is about. So that of course dramatically takes one away from more spiritual and ethical pursuits. Yeah, so this racialized order of capitalism, both capitalism and racialization, serve to simultaneously reduce human beings, to a kind of biological reality which does not correspond to either their natures or to the nature of reality itself. Yeah. So that's, and this is of course part of the reparative project. So I've, last year our conference was on reparative futures, reparation, as I was emphasizing in the introduction to this conference as well, and Farid has also gestured towards that. The reparative part of Habib's pedagogical vision, or mission, is also at work in this question. This deracialization is closely linked to the process of hooking up with these inheritances and legacies, which Farid was gesturing towards. Yeah, racialization, and I really appreciate that point also about the fact that racialization is a major cognitive block. Yeah, it does not, racialization interferes with our cognition yeah, of our reality. And I think I'll just stop there. Thank you so much once again to all of you, to all of the people who helped with this conference. I'd actually especially like to thank 𝐒𝐨𝐲𝐴 Shah over here at Habib University, who is always with us whenever we do any of these programs and has helped once again. He's sitting with me in this room right here, helped me throughout this conference. And I won't name everybody else, but thank you, Shama, and especially thank you, Mishal Khan and Farid Azfar for these wonderful presentations. This has been just an excellent panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing the work you do. Where would we be if you didn't do that work?
So much. Very kind. Acha ji, Khuda Hafiz.
Hafiz.
Thank you.
Khuda Hafiz.